As I was saying, I want to be mindful of the time, and I don't want to get distracted by all the chat. My name is Andrea, and I am your host for this evening. With myself, I have Mika, who will be introducing herself shortly. We make up part of the Juris Education team. Just before we get into tonight's discussion, all about the LSAT 101, everything you need to know, I have just a couple of housekeeping rules, so to speak. The number one question we get is this recorded? Yes, this webinar is recorded. What does that mean? That means that within a day or two, we will make sure we get this uploaded. We will make sure this gets sent to you to your email. So the email that you use to register for tonight's event will be the email that you receive the video link. Make sure you check your spam as well, because I know sometimes that tends to happen. In terms of how long we're looking at running tonight's discussion, we're looking at running tonight's discussion for an hour or so. We have a lot to go over. So we'll be speaking about effective study techniques, mastering logical reasoning, understanding reading comp strategies. I have effective study techniques in there twice. I apologize. We'll be going over insider tips from Adopt Score as well. We love to leave some room towards the end for a Q&A. So throughout the webinar, obviously you will have lots of questions, and I hopefully everyone is taking notes. Please don't hesitate to use the chat box to ask your questions, and Mika will be able to hopefully be able to respond to them, as many of them as possible.
Absolutely. If I don't drone on too much.
So before we do that, before I pass it off to Mika, I just want to quickly introduce yourselves, because I know there's a lot of new faces in tonight's session. So as mentioned earlier, we're Juris Education. We're a globally recognized law school admissions consulting firm, offering comprehensive support from test prep to law school admissions and even bar exam tutoring. So we have a 94% acceptance rate. Our students get into the top law schools in the United States. Last cycle alone, our T14 acceptance rate was 34%, which is almost 6 times higher than the national average of 5.7%, something that we're incredibly proud of. We believe in starting the law school application process as early as possible. You'll hear Mika mention this a few times. And this is why we offer something called pre-law advising and profile development. Essentially what this is this focuses on building each student's professional cover letter and resume to highlight their most unique and meaningful experiences. We also help candidates boost their academic transcripts and GPA, find stellar internships, create a timeline for LSAT prep. All of this is done with one goal in mind, and that's to get applicants into their dream law program. Our private LSAT tutors assess each candidate's strengths and weaknesses. This helps create a custom study plan structure for the days, weeks, and months ahead. We tailor our approach to each student's unique needs and schedule, providing the right assessments and lessons as they become familiar with the test content, strategies, and format. On average, we see a 12-point increase for 45 plus hours of tutoring, and we do offer a 165 plus score guarantee with our 60-hour program. Now, once we help shape an outstanding candidate, we support in creating the perfect application. So this looks like the creation of a well-balanced list of target, safety, and reach schools. We also help build strong resumes and obtain letters of recommendation from the right recommenders. Our admissions counselors, who are also essay writing experts, will brainstorm, outline, and edit your supplemental essays and personal statements until they are perfect. Our goal is to build the perfect candidate and application. We use every tool in our skill set to ensure the products we create with our students stand out from the rest. We're so excited to be here, folks. We're so excited to help you with this process, and we're looking forward to all your questions and your consultations in just tonight's session. So Mika, I'd love to pass it over to you to introduce yourself. But before I do that, one quick thing I forgot to mention, I apologize. We will be going over some live LSAT questions. So I don't know if I mentioned that. I apologize if I'm repeating myself or if I did not mention it, but we want to make sure that you kind of have some time to see how Mika, who, as you can see, is a 179 scorer, and how she tutors. It'd be really interesting, I think, to give you guys that additional understanding and kind of put all the strategies that she'll be discussing to work. So Mika, I'll leave it to you now.
Hi, I'm Mika MacDonald. As it says, I'm an LSAT tutor here with Juris. I also do admissions consulting, and of course I give webinars. I took the LSAT twice, both in 2011. In June, I scored a 172, and then in October, I scored a 179. I attended the University of Chicago Law School, graduated in 2015. I clerked for a bankruptcy judge in Delaware, then worked as a corporate litigator for about 5.5 years. Left the practice of law during the pandemic and came back to tutoring and teaching, and I've been doing this for about 3 years now. Really excited. I always like these big overview ones. And I also I really like to do demos with big groups. It's a lot of fun to just kind of teach and talk. So let's dive in. I apologize, my partner's in the background if you see shadows behind me. So first and foremost, let's talk about the journey and how to improve. A lot of people have worse study habits than they think, worse learning habits than they think. A lot of people put too much pressure on themselves to move too quickly, right? There's a lot of ways to stumble with the LSAT, but the biggest one is to throw yourself at a wall and expect the wall to break. So big rule number one is accuracy first, speed second, right? If you can't do it untimed, you're not going to do better timed. I mean, maybe a really tiny percentage of people are like adrenaline junkies or something and they do better, but stick with untimed practice until you hit your goal score. So set a goal score. Do you want to go to this school? Well, make sure you be above that school's median LSAT, right? Find a goal score, stick with untimed practice till you hit it. Another big thing is how to study effectively. Like one of my biggest tips to every student doing this, if you watch a video on a topic or a question type, immediately do a little bit of practice of it, right? Studies show that we lose 50% or more of what we learned overnight. So if you wait till the next day to practice, you're really like kind of slowing down your own growth process. Another big thing is a question journal. There's not any LSAT specific studies on this, but for ACT and SAT, there's a lot of research that says journaling about your mistakes really helps you improve quickly, right? Really accelerates the mastery process. This is actually something that you should think about as you start your LSAT journey, which is, can I improve my study and learning habits, right? Have I noticed things in the past that maybe I'm not doing the right way? And can I improve that as part of studying for the LSAT? Second big thing is patience. People talk about these LSAT naturals. I've been in the legal world for more than a decade, and I don't know anyone who fits that description. Nobody just rolls up and aces this exam. I know tutors. I went to Chicago. I was a lawyer. No one I've ever spoken to has said that. I tell people that about 150 hours is a good target before your first exam. I would say that because that's about how much I studied to get my 172, 150 to 200 hours. I actually started working as an LSAT tutor way back when, after I got my 172. And by October, right between June and October, I probably put in another 150. So I did like at least 300 of hours of study to get a 179, right? I say all this because I also want to emphasize that this is an achievable goal, right? I have a student, or had a student, who went from a 137 to a 177, right? That's about as big a jump as you can ever make, really. It took him a long time and a lot of work, but he did it. And he just finished his first semester at a T14. And he also was in the top 10% of his class. I'm really proud of him. But you have to be patient with yourself throughout the process. Commit to a real study schedule. Don't overestimate the amount of time you're going to work. That's not helpful because then you're holding yourself up to a standard that was always unrealistic. So think about what is a realistic amount of time you can commit each week, and then figure out what days and times you want to do that at and commit to it. Put it on your calendar, right? Haphazard study is significantly less effective and less reliable than consistent study. And again, learning studies would show that doing things haphazardly slows the mastery process. And the final thing is, what do I do, right? When you self-study, it's like, well, how do you build a study plan for something you know nothing about, right? So I strongly recommend that you use a curriculum, right, of some kind. A tutor like me can provide one for sure. There's plenty of resources online. There's test prep companies. There's lots of stuff. But it is very, very important you find a curriculum of some kind. Getting lost because you don't even know what to do next is a really unpleasant feeling and can lead to giving up, right, to burnout. So yeah, biggest key is to take the journey seriously, but don't rush yourself. So there are 2 sections on the LSAT. This is LSAT 101, so I'll kind of build out from the slides a bit. There's the logical reasoning section and the reading comp section. On an actual test, there are 2 scored logical reasoning sections and 1 scored reading comp section. So LR is theoretically twice as important. Both things are very difficult. For those of you who have never seen a logical reasoning question, we're definitely going to do we're going to do 2 or 3 of them later. Logical reasoning questions are short prompts, 1, 2, maybe 3, very rarely paragraphs in length, but typically 1 paragraph in length. And for the most part, they deal with arguments. What are the parts of an argument? Can you identify the main conclusion? Can you correctly describe the role played by a certain statement in the argument? You have questions like strengthen and weaken, right, where you're interacting with the argument. Reading comp is reading comp. You've done it for the SAT or some other sort of, test at some point in time. But the reading comp on the LSAT is much more focused on understanding what the author is doing than just understanding the content itself, right? You have to really think about the author's intent, right? You have to be able to describe why the author is using a certain phrase or word. You have to describe what was the main point, which is more substantive, and also the author's purpose, which is more of a description of what they're trying to achieve, right? So you can see how it's like adds a big layer of complexity. You get 35 minutes per section. There are 27 questions in reading comp, so that gives you about a little over a minute per question, but you also are reading a long essay, like at least a page in length. And there are 25 questions in logical reasoning, so that's a little over like minute 20 something per question. So a big part of this test ultimately will be speed. All right, so let's circle back to what are the key skills for both sections? What are the big things you should be paying attention to? First and foremost, the LSAT questions are repetitive to some degree. For example, there is a certain concept called correlation, inferring causation from correlation alone. The LSAT considers that flawed reasoning. You need more than just correlation to infer causation. There are at least like 45 questions in the history of the LSAT that 100% throw this exact same issue up. So being able to spot concepts like this, give them names, and then being able to see them when they reappear on the exam is a big part of success here, right? You need to see what's common across the different question types. Second big thing to think about is the LSAT is sort of written in like legal/literary language from the 1950s. It's very archaic wording, and they deliberately do the English language back. Okay, like it's a tactic that they use to enhance the difficulty level of what we're doing. And it's pretty realistic because once you become a lawyer, you're going to have to read a lot of terribly written and highly confusing writing. So in that sense, it genuinely is good prep. So a big part here is understanding how they use the English language poorly and how to cope with that. What are the tactics for getting around the confusion they try to create? A big part of both sections, right, is I feel like I may have just hit this point, but a systematic approach. For example, once you set a study schedule, also start to think about, okay, do I want to have certain recurring things each week? Like Sunday will be my reading comp day. Or do I think I'll be really tired on Monday evening, so I'm going to do videos on Monday evenings always? Things like this, right? Be reflective throughout the process, right? As you move through your study plan, adjust your study plan thoughtfully. Stubbornly sticking to a timeline that's not going to work, or ignoring certain deficiencies and skills when you really need those skills to build subsequent skills is not good, right? So be reflective about what you need to be doing to improve. And yeah, improve by making tweaks, right? By reflecting on how you're feeling and what's going poorly and what's going well. All right. Excuse me. So as I mentioned before, logical reasoning accounts for 2 of the 3 scored sections on the LSAT. I like to group these questions into 3 areas, which are identification questions, where you're not interacting with the argument, right? We're not attacking it, defending it, and so on. We're just kind of describing what the argument is doing. So question like, identify the main conclusion. Or I mentioned this one before, the role of a statement. Flaw kind of fits in multiple categories, but describing what's flawed about the argument. We have interaction questions, which are probably the biggest chunk of the LSAT by far, honestly, in terms of just total number of questions. But we have interaction ones: strengthen an argument, weaken an argument, provide the necessary assumption for an argument, provide a sufficient assumption for an argument. I know that that's not very clear to you, but we're going to look at one of those questions later and it'll be more clear. And then we have inferential questions, where we are trying to use the data the LSAT gives us to make a reasoned conclusion. So instead of attacking or defending someone else's conclusion, now we're making our own. A lot of these questions share skill set, obviously. For example, it's really hard to strengthen an argument without identifying the main conclusion of the argument, right? So there is a tier of skills to build up. And so even though main conclusion is one of the smallest question types by number, it's also the most fundamental skill. So think about that as you plan out how you're going to study. Think about the skill progression involved. I just talked about the language issue. I'm going to re-emphasize it. People really underestimate the amount of difficulty on the LSAT caused by the language they're using. And they also really underestimate how intentional it is by the test makers. So I will just again really emphasize that having a strong grasp of the English language and having methods for untangling poorly written complex sentences is really important here. It's a skill to build. And again, I'll also emphasize studying just question type by question type is kind of like, you know, missing the forest for the trees, right? You can't just neatly divide the skill set here. For example, I would say that causation as a concept is the most important concept on the LSAT, but none of these question types are called causation. But if you don't study how to make arguments about causation, you're going to do poorly in a lot of these question types. So you need to pay attention to broader skill set in addition to just question types. I'm not saying don't look at question types, because there are definitely best practices, best procedures to move efficiently, right? Because again, this is super time pressured. So it's not just enough to have the skill set, it's being able to apply it quickly. But again, mastery of skills, then mastery of procedures. All right, let's keep rolling. So excelling in reading comp is all about understanding what the author's doing. And I mean that in the sense of I subscribe to a thought process where there are 7 frameworks for the essays that are used in the LSAT, right? And one of those is called problem solution, right? Because all of these essays that fit into that category, the author basically raises a problem and then provides their own solution or analyzes other proposed solutions from other people, right? I would say within one paragraph of any reading comp passage, I can identify what framework I'm in, right? And that framework tells me a lot about the author's goals, which in turn tells me a lot about how to answer main point questions, primary purpose questions, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Once you get a good grasp of these structures and can identify them quickly, I would just say that the rest of the questions, or basically the questions themselves, are easier to answer, significantly easier. I liken it to some research. There's really good research out there, like, why do legal briefs basically all get structured the exact same way? And one of the answers, and probably a really big answer, I think, maybe the biggest one, is familiarity. Right? If I'm a judge, I don't want to be confused about what part of the brief I'm in, right? I like the predictability. I know that this is where the intro is, then this is the statement of jurisdiction, and then this is the case history, and I know that that's the order, and so I can focus more on the information I'm being given without having to think much about the order. So that's kind of how I would describe this. The second you know what framework you're in, it becomes much easier to just focus on what you're being given. Yeah. I am a note taker. There are basically three approaches here, or in a mix of them. You can active read, which I think is a bad idea because these are dense and they can be about very boring topics, and it's easy to lose track of what you're doing when you're just active reading. Highlighting, which is better, and note-taking, which is best. And when I say best, I also mean scientifically proven to be the best, or the best we can prove it. All the research in the world says that handwritten notes lead to much more retention and mastery of topics than highlighting or passive reading by a large margin. But we have time pressure, which is why a lot of people abandon note-taking, because it slows them down too much. So my answer here is just, you shouldn't abandon note-taking. You should get better at it. Note-taking not only helps you remember, it gives you a written map. A lot of questions in reading comp are very detail-oriented, and one of them is just called locate detail, where they basically pitch you on which one of these things was actually said in the passage, right? So having this built-in map that you created can help you retrieve information much more quickly than if you just keep rereading and then going back and then rereading and then going back. That's a huge waste of time, right? So when you also think about note-taking, think about that part. Note-taking takes more time up front, but it's going to save a lot of time on the back end if you get good at your note-taking skills. And maybe we'll have a seminar, webinar at some point where I'll walk through that or something. You'd have to ask them, but now that I think of it, that sounds like a pretty cool idea, the substance of it. Last thing is, once the LSAT went digital, we were technically allowed to use Control Find, right? Control F. But last year, they removed that ability, and instead they built their own search box in, which auto-highlights any instances of the word you're searching for. So you can see why that's a pretty good tool for retrieving information quickly. But if you're not good at using search terms, if you're not thinking wisely about them, it can also be really misleading, right? So again, this is a skill that is acquired, right, through thought and practice. How do I use the search box effectively and efficiently? But again, once you acquire that skill, you will become a lot more efficient, and that will lead to a lot of improvement. Yeah. All right. So just doing like a little summary here. Be thoughtful, right? As you move through this, analyze what your results are and think about what you're doing well and poorly on. Most like test trackers that you could subscribe to will have some sort of like mastery level tracker, right? Or it'll have analytics with percentages, something. But always be mindful of what am I struggling on and whether I need to improve that skill before I try to improve other things, right? I really want to emphasize that skills build on each other. Active review methods. It's not enough to just go read an answer explanation, right? Passively reading an answer explanation will not dig it in nearly as much as if you journal about it, right? Rewrite it in your own words. That sticks a lot better, and that leads to speed and improvement. I also think journaling is valuable because of this idea of there are patterns on the test, right? There are certain structures that get reused, certain topics that show up over and over again. And journaling really helps you track that, right? You can even, if you're using like an Excel file, boom, you just add another column and you can start naming the patterns you see, and then you can sort by pattern. Boom, you can see all these related questions and how they're using the same idea. And then just adjust. I've said that again already, so I'll just move on from this, but be mindful, adjust. This test is over 3 hours, right? You're going to do 4 total sections. Didn't talk about it before, but on every actual exam, there are 3 scored sections, the 2 LR and 1 RC. And then there's a 4th experimental section, which could be LR or RC. But it's not scored, it's them testing questions that they'll use in future exams. So you get a 10-minute break in between section 2 and 3. But this is exhausting, right? 3-hour exams, pretty darn exhausting. And this is a very exhausting, intellectually intense topic. So there are some people that have naturally developed that intellectual stamina. I'm going to show off and say I played chess competitively all through middle and high school. And so I was used to sitting at a board thinking for 4 hours at a time. But it's true. That's something you train for, right? Like sitting and completely focusing for that long in a row is exhausting and a skill. So do full length test condition practice tests, right? You're not going to develop that stamina unless you actually go run that distance a few times. Again, I'll emphasize that the first few practice tests you take, do not do timed, right? Get to your goal score and then switch to time tests. But you do need to build this stamina, right? It really, I have students where they don't take practice tests. They just take individual sections. And I get it, we're all busy and it's hard to fit like a 3-hour block in somewhere, especially if you're working, right, full-time or have kids. It's really difficult. And I understand that. But it is critical to do this, right? I just want to emphasize the importance of it. The last thing, and probably one of the most overlooked things, is this is a tough process emotionally on anyone. For one, you're just going to get things wrong over and over and over again. You're going to get red X's over and over and over again. And that hurts a little, right? Ego hurts when we just keep getting things wrong. And unlike a lot of other types of tests where you just need to memorize the information, this one hurts because it's not, you can't just memorize and get better. It's skills. But you have to be able to take that, right? And not take it personally. And as I emphasized before, 137 to 177, right? This is not impossible, but it will be an ordeal, right? It's going to be an effort. I'll also emphasize that on test day, right, that is going to be an intense and tough experience for most people. If you're the sort of person who likes public speaking, then maybe test day is like, yeah, let's do it. And again, I'll kind of say I am kind of that person. Like I was a litigator. I like people listening to me. I like being seen. But for most people, that's not the way you feel, right? There are a lot of nerves and stress, and you've put so much time and effort into this and like 150 hours of study, and now you're taking a 3-hour exam, and all of those hours are from this. So you have to be able to manage your emotions, right? Mindfulness stuff is really powerful here. The biggest thing I tell people is that calm and methodical is always better than being rushed or being tilted. and that you should not be afraid to pause, breathe, and recenter yourself. Even if it takes 10 seconds, that's good, that's better, right? You don't need those 10 seconds. I know that things feel rushed, but what you really need is to be methodical. Yeah, that's how you get, 160, 170 plus score. All right. So another sort of big summary of what we've talked about so far. Universal skills, right? Really think of it as like building scaffolding, right? You're building a building one level at a time. And you can't just jump to the top level, right? That doesn't work. You got to build towards it. So focus on these universal skills, how to handle the language, understanding the recurring structures and argument types, understanding the framework, essay frameworks, and reading comp. Yeah, that plays a huge role in success. I also mentioned things like causation and using comparison-based evidence for causation. Those are such fundamental concepts to so many questions, but they're not question types. So think about these things and hopefully find a curriculum and a tutor that can help you figure these things out, that can give you that guidebook, that roadmap to understanding both the question types and the skill set. Breaking the code, I think this is the most underrated difficulty of the LSAT. That's why I keep bringing it up. It is deliberately poorly written, but in very systematic ways that can be decoded, right? Can be beaten back. The better you are at rewriting poor English in your head, the faster you'll move on this exam. I would say it's a key component of speed, right? If you have to read what they wrote 4 times to unpack it, that's costing you a lot of time. So I even tell sometimes people that I have a few resources I use that are basically stuff from like grammar school, right? Like 6th grade grammar. But some of that stuff is really powerful to get a refresher on here. So add that to what you're studying. Okay. Excuse me. So what sets apart, I guess, people like me or like my student, right? It's the commitment, right? I worked hard to get there. I was single-minded and dedicated. That student I mentioned and all of my students that have scored in the 170s, right? It's commitment. And again, I'll emphasize commitment is also commitment to your study schedule, commitment to be regular and routine about it and to not let other things in life displace it constantly, right? You have to commit to a lot of stuff to make that much progress, but it is, again, possible. I'll also emphasize something here, which is the importance of your LSAT score. There is no doubt that it is the most important thing on your application. It is definitely more important than GPA, especially because score inflation has been happening intensely with GPAs, and so it's not that hard to find super high GPAs. LSAT scores are on a curve, right? The same percentage of people supposedly going to hit those same score points. Yeah. And every point of the LSAT's worth about $10,000 in scholarship money, right? That's the sort of broad mental math you should do. If you can get into a school and you score 5 points higher, you're probably getting a 1 or 2 year scholarship than compared to that original score. So I'll make the soft pitch here. Tutoring sounds like a deal in comparison to $50,000 in debt. Just saying. Effective study, right? High quality materials, right? Do your research and don't just rely on free resources. For one, LSAC, the people who make the test, are very copyright powerful. They will come after anyone who prints reproductions of actual questions without licensing them. Free materials usually result from very, very limited releases by LSAC. if you want access to more, you're going to have to use test prep. There's also great books, great guides out there. When I talked about that skill set, right, there's materials for building that. So do your research, go out there and find the stuff that works for you. And remember, like, everybody's a different type of learner. Videos, direct tutoring, reading, slides, note cards, flashcards, I mean. There are a lot of ways to approach study here, and you should think about what has historically worked for you in the past. Commit to your study schedule and confront your mistakes, right? I cannot tell you how frustrating it is as a tutor when I can tell a student's ego is getting in the way of them learning from what's happening, right? I also cannot tell you how much I don't care about a minute-long explanation for why you were not at fault for missing the question. That's time that you're paying for with me, right? It's time that I could be teaching you, or you could be more explanatory of your thought process and the steps that you went through in that thought process, so that I can then examine that thought process and identify when your mistake happened and how you can improve from it, right? So really just kind of like shed the ego as much as you can, because you're gonna be wrong a lot. I was wrong a lot and I got better. And then emotional resilience. It's a big project, it's tough, it's time consuming, it's challenging. Burnout is a big deal here, right? Take a day off every week. Honestly, please don't try to study all 7 days every week. You will hate the topic within probably a month, maybe 2. Everybody needs breaks, including from this. So be mindful of where you are, and if you feel like you're starting to burn out, give yourself like 3 days off or something, right? Don't think about the test. Don't do anything with the test. Just, you don't want to burn out. And finally, again, once you get through all of this, there's a big, hopefully, pot of gold, right? Admission to the school of your dreams, and maybe even a big scholarship from them. And then the sort of career that you're imagining. So this is going to be a tough journey. But if this is what you want, it's going to be a really worthwhile one. All right, I'll turn it back over to Andrea for a bit of a check-in, and then we're going to take a look at some actual questions after that, and then we'll have the Q&A. All right, take it away, Andrea.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I want to do a really quick check-in. Mika, we have a lot of committed people in the chat. I don't know if you see that, but it's really nice to see. So I think, thank you for
I appreciate that.
Yeah, all this awesome value in here. So I had asked a question in the chat about coming up with some sort of note-taking webinar or something of that sort, and we had a lot of people say yes. So I just want to take a moment to see that we did see that, and I will take that back to my team, and we'll keep you updated with maybe we can pull something together, and we can have Mika speak at that as well. I don't see too many other. I don't really see any other questions in the chat, but I'll give everybody a moment to get them in there. If you have any questions for us. So somebody's asking about tutoring prices. That's a really great question. Neither Mika nor I are on the sales team. So what we recommend is booking a consultation. Our consultations are completely free. You can sit down with one of our awesome colleagues who not only work in sales, but have a lot of admissions consulting experience. They can talk you through the numbers. They can talk through any additional questions you may have. Excuse me. And just on that, we are offering a 10% code for you all who are live on this call. It's 10 off web. Just as a little thank you for joining us live tonight. So, how can we access the recording of this webinar? Yes. Okay. So I see that in here a couple of times. Really great question. So you will receive a recording of this webinar in your inbox, your email inbox tomorrow or in the next couple of days. So if you just bear with us, we can get it uploaded. Don't forget to check your spam, but it should be there. Mika, what was the phrase again for causation and applying it to questions?
So I will say that as a hard rule on the LSAT, one correlation. So like saying when it gets cold out, I get sad, right? That's a correlation. But if we say the cold outside is keeping me from doing the things I want to do, and that's making me sad, that's causation. So recognizing the distinction between how the two are expressed, and then as a hard rule in the LSAT, one correlation alone cannot sufficiently support a causation conclusion. You need at least one other piece of evidence to support the causation conclusion. That's kind of like the broad area there.
So there's a really great question in the chat. Is it possible to have a sales team member join occasionally? That is something we are exploring. So we will keep everyone up to date because we do get these sort of questions often enough. And there was another question I just wanted to address. Yes, you can access the consultation for pricing as well. So not a worry.
It'll have all that info.
Yeah, they have absolutely all that info. That QR code on screen should take you back to a landing page where you're able to book that consultation. So there's a ton of questions in here. Mika, I think maybe we can get to one or two before, maybe one actually, because I want to be mindful of time. We have 3 live questions coming up. What sort of LSAT materials do you recommend? And I think onto that, I would love to add, there's a question in here about past LSATs that are published, and how far back do you recommend they go through as practice?
So it's a good question. They definitely started, they're mostly the same. Answer choices and questions are phrased a bit weirder or in the early LSATs. And the language has changed to some degree. Topics have changed. Like I would say, like, for example, the LSAT used to have a lot of morality language in it. And then around like PT 70 or so, they stopped using that. And I think they just kind of wanted to get away from like loaded terminology like that. So basically, all of the tests are valid, right? Going all the way back. But it is better to be using the more recent material, I would say. So if you have done tons and tons and tons of study, you're 100 hours in, it's fine if you're using stuff from like PT 45, right? Because you've already used all the recent stuff, and that's normal. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, Mika, I'm going to pass it back to you to kind of get into the questions.
All right, so we've got 3 question types we're going to do. All of these are from the logical reasoning section. So they're basically a 1-paragraph prompt, and we're going to be asked to do something. So in the first one, we're weakening an argument, right? So we have to think first about what is the argument's conclusion, right? We cannot weaken something without understanding the something. Then we have to think about, well, what sort of support is provided for this? Is it, for example, a medical study with a test group and a control group, right? And when I mentioned comparisons proving causation earlier on, that's an example of that, right? We compare, we change one variable, we compare the outcomes. In a paradox question, we are given 2 outcomes that seemingly seem in conflict. Right? That it doesn't seem like both things should be able to be happening at the same time. Or you might have a surprising contrast where 2 things that seem like they should be similar are not being similar. And so in these ones, we're basically providing causation, right? We're explaining how this could happen. And finally, most strongly supported is the most common inference type question, right? So we're given a series of related statements, and then we're asked to identify the most reasonable inference we can draw from them. So we're providing a conclusion, right? And again, most of those questions involve causation, right? A lot of most strongly supported questions are just long chains of causation, and then we sum up the entire chain as a conclusion. So let's check it out. Our first example, and I like to read aloud, I always say read the question stem first. You want to know what you're doing to the argument before you read the argument. So here it says, which of the following statements, if true, most undermines this argument. So weaken, undermine, weaken. I also want to emphasize that if true part. When we're analyzing answer choices in a question like this, we are assuming that this would be true, right? We're not attacking whether the answer choice has evidence supporting it. The question is stipulating that take it as true for the purposes of this. Okay, so the art historian tells us that a recent excavation uncovered a marble bust of Pope Leo IX that my colleague has attributed to Michelangelo. He argues that the proportion of its bust, its distinctive gaze, and the Calcutta marble are all trademarks of Michelangelo. I agree these factors are all typical of Michelangelo's work, but are equally applicable to Raphael's early period. Moreover, the excavation took place in a region Michelangelo is not known to have visited. Therefore, the bust should be attributed to Raphael. So, I think the conclusion here is pretty straightforward, right? Therefore, the bust should be attributed to Raphael. I'm trying to weaken this, so I want to examine the existing reasoning, right? Don't just jump into answer choices. When we're doing most of these LR questions, what we wanted to do is have an anticipation, right? And good anticipation typically comes from recognizing patterns. So let's look what pattern I see here. So I asked myself first, okay, it should be attributed. Why? And I see, okay, the author looked at 3 factors and said, hey, this could go either way. But it's not possible that we know that Michelangelo had never been in this region. So one extra piece of evidence is tipping the scales here. So we can weaken arguments by providing new information that comes from a different, unusual angle. We can also weaken arguments by attacking the existing evidence. So the question here is, what are the options? So I'm trying to anticipate something here. And I go, okay, maybe there's something that really distinctly points in Michelangelo's favor that we're not being told about, right? So the art historian is not giving us all of the important facts. There's something that strongly indicates that it was Michelangelo and not Raphael. Or, and here's where we talk about the subtlety of the LSAT. Did this ever tell me whether Raphael had been to that region? No. Yeah, never told us that. It implied it very strongly, but it did not specifically state it. So this is a type of recurring argument issue, right? There's at least I think 60-ish historical questions that do this. And what I would say it's assuming a difference, right? It is silently and implicitly assuming that 2 things are different without actually saying that they are different. So I have 2 options here, right? Maybe there's other evidence that points towards Michelangelo, or maybe there's no evidence that Raphael has ever been to this area either, right? Both of those would strongly weaken. So I'm going to look for either of them, right? I have an anticipation of possibilities. So A, Raphael was known primarily for his skill as a painter. No. B, the region where the bust was never visited by Raphael. Okay. So that evidence that our author was entirely depending on is now worthless, right? Because there's no difference between Raphael and Michelangelo in this regard either. Just to go through the other ones and talk about why they are tempting wrong answers, because the LSAT makes the wrong answers tempting, and they're strategic about it. So I'll say this is a practice tip too. When you get an answer wrong, review all of the wrong answers. right? Take the time and think about what were all of the different types of things they were doing. That helps you master the traps better, more quickly. So C, Michelangelo mentored Raphael during the early period of his career, but later described his work as inferior. So this one's trying to it's trying to make you think that Michelangelo is correct, and therefore the quality of this bust indicates that it's Michelangelo's and not Raphael, right? But it just says that he described it, right? It doesn't say that as a measure, it was actually inferior, right? But this is trying to get you to sort of buy into a value judgment, and that clouds your thought process of what is the actual conclusion and what is the actual evidence it's relying on. D would be the exact opposite of a weaken, right? That's our anti-answer. So what if you had 2 strengthen questions in a row right before this? So you had a strengthen, a weaken. Is it possible that your brain might approach this like it was a strengthen because that's what the last 2 questions were? So D is that trap answer. If your brain's still running in strengthen mode, then D is the obvious answer. So you can see the trap. E, Michelangelo completed out of busts, but he was known to favor Botticini marble. Right? It doesn't matter, right? We know that the Calcutta marble is still a trademark, right? Telling us that he's liked another type of marble a little bit more, not really a weakener. All right, paradoxes. This is my favorite question type. This is basically put on your Sherlock Holmes hat and explain what happened here. And I find that fun. When I'm tutoring, I start with this topic, right? Because it's a great introduction to how the LSAT can be enjoyable and interesting in certain ways. So let's take a look. Which of the following best explains the paradoxical situation described above? So the American Motor Company prioritizes vehicle performance over safety, and as a result produces vehicles that consistently rank as the least safe to operate in the event of a collision. Despite this, American Motor Company vehicle owners are far less likely than the average driver to be involved in a collision resulting in injury. Okay, little bit of a paradox, right? Why are the people driving the least safe cars seemingly having more safe outcomes than average? It's a bit surprising. So when I think about this, I just think about alternative explanations, right? What could make these people have better outcomes? So one idea that immediately pops to mind is, what other than a car affects the likelihood of being in a collision? Maybe the skill of the driver, right? So in this one, I think about what else could be relevant apart from the model of car you're driving. And the biggest one I can instantly think of is skill, right? Maybe the people who buy these cars are better at driving. And in reality, that's kind of the only explanation here, right? What else affects the likelihood of getting into a collision? Skill and the car models seem to be mostly that. Yeah. Skill of other drivers, mental state of driver, that's true. That's true. But from a systematic point of view, right? Can we say that the mental state of the drivers of all of these cars is better than average? I think skill probably is a better explanation, right? But yeah, I think everybody in chat is getting this right. But thank you, Nia. Those were both great ideas and great thought process. I don't want to diminish that at all. Yeah, it's D. I think all of you got it really well now. You can see, but again, let's look at those wrong answers and talk about why they can be tempting. So A is trying to make you think that because these are expensive cars, that rich people drive them, and I guess that rich people are better at driving. A is one of those things that's like trying to entice you into making a bunch of extra inferences, right? But I definitely don't think I would say that people who drive expensive cars are better drivers on average. In fact, I might argue the exact opposite. But my point is, A is trying to invite you to bring in your outside beliefs. A lot of wrong answers on the LSAT are doing exactly that. They're just trying to tempt you into bringing the real world into this. And you can't let that happen. B, drivers likely to involve collisions are typically unaware. So B is one of those answers where it's like, maybe the drivers that buy these cars are aware. But again, they didn't say that, right? It's something that may be sort of softly implied, but the LSAT doesn't honor implications. Either you say it or you didn't say it. So they didn't say the other thing they needed to make B useful. C is one of those answers where I think it's just a confusing statement. But if we think about this here, that doesn't explain American Motor Company specifically. Right? And we really, really need something that explains this scenario with American Motor Company specifically. D obviously is great, right? They're high skilled, so they get into fewer crashes. And E, again, is like trying to invite you to make some sort of like judgment about the quality of the cars. And it's basically just trying to lead you on a different pathway. Like, we just want to get a handle on why they're less likely. We don't care about any other aspect of the car. All right. I know we're running a little short on time, so we'll try and move through this one decently quick. I'm sorry, usually there's a little more time and I could like field questions about this, but we're going to have to roll through it. So finally, we've got a most strongly supported question, right? It was D, I think. Yes. Buyers who prioritize performance over safety are typically much more skilled. All right, so most strongly supported, right? We are making a conclusion based on information given to us. So let's check it out. Recent years, scientists have discovered two variations of an avian virus. Version 1A targets the central nervous system. Version 1B primarily targets the circulatory system, okay? Recently, a vaccine has been developed that immunizes patients to both versions of the virus, while a previous vaccine immunized patients to only version 1B of the virus. So what I tell people with these ones is just try to think about what they're doing here and then move in. Don't try to predict the answer, just kind of describe what they're doing. So if I were to describe this, I would say they're telling us that these two similar things are different in a certain way, which is what they target. And then they tell us that there was a vaccine that applied to only one, but now there's a vaccine that applies to both. Okay, I have re-summarized the argument in my head in a sort of very structural way. I'm going to go look and see what we've got here. So with A, prior to the development of the new vaccine, many people developed both circulatory and central nervous system issues. So there's a few problems with this. Number one of which is, did they really tell us before, other than to say a previous, I'm going to say a previous vaccine, not the only previous vaccine. They didn't say only here. They said A, right? A previous vaccine immunized patients to only version 1B. That seems to sort of almost contradict that last sentence, right? B, immunization rates have increased dramatically. Again, this is sort of a value judgment where you're like, oh, so now that the new vaccine does both, of course, lots of people are getting it. But nothing in the argument itself says that, right? Maybe this vaccine, I don't know, was way less effective, right? It only gives you like 75% immunity, whereas the previous one was 99%, right? Or maybe most people don't need both, right? So B again is like, just, we don't have the info for it. C. Now, I'll tell you what's great about C. When we think about making an inference like, it will rain tomorrow, right? It will rain tomorrow. Now think about the difference between what evidence you need to support that statement and the amount of evidence you need to set to support the idea that it might rain tomorrow. It's a much lower evidentiary burden because the conclusion is less intense. So if we're drawing conclusions from limited data, we really like soft words, right? Much easier to support soft words. So yeah, Diana got it. I really like may. May now be protected from both. And then I think about it and I said, okay, well, the new vaccine protects against both. Version 1A targets the central nervous system. Version B targets the circulatory system. So if it targets both, that could be pretty good. So I like C. Let's hold on to it. D, patients who receive the new vaccine will not suffer from virus-related health issues. Did they say that the vaccine was 100% effective? Right? No vaccine is 100% effective, right? That's one of the problems with vaccines, is because we can't get everybody, and therefore those people, herd immunity, all that stuff. It's way too strong. We don't have the evidence to support will not. E, any vaccine that protects against multiple versions of the virus is superior in all respects. In all respects to a vaccine that protects against only one version. If that said it is superior, and it didn't say in all respects, that would be a much more defensible answer. But I think I already talked, well, what about cost? What if the new one takes 10,000 times the amount of effort to make, right? What if the new one is less effective, but it is effective against both, whereas the single one is 100% effective against one of them, right? Yeah, E is something that feels so obviously true, right, that it's easy to jump to it. And that is the most tempting type of wrong answer, and I'm most strongly supported, right? The answer that feels so obviously true in the real world that it feels like, oh, it must be the right answer here. So yeah, C is our best answer, because all it says is if you get the new vaccine, you may be protected against both types of issues. Yeah. So you can see how, like, the LSAT is wild, but it can kind of be interesting. I think so. I teach it. Like, clearly I love it. Otherwise I wouldn't do this for a profession. There's a lot of fun stuff that goes into it. It's just a lot of work too. But having good mindset definitely makes it easier. So I really appreciate you all coming out today. Just a few final thoughts. Consistency and commitment. Consistency and commitment. You can do this, right? Getting that score you want is possible. It's going to take work and time and commitment, but you absolutely can do it, right? Be thoughtful during your study journey. Be reflective, right? And think about what you can do better, what you're doing worse at, and how to focus on those things. Again, I'll do that pitch. I think I'm pretty darn good at what I do, and I think highly of Juris Education and our tutoring team and our admissions consulting team. Hiring good people that can help accelerate your process is very, very valuable. So, if you want to jump onto that code from before, if you want to submit feedback on this, all of that is super appreciated. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Speaking of feedback, before we let you go, because we want to maybe spend like 2 or 3 minutes just answering any sort of questions you have, we'd love your feedback. So if you love this call, We'd love it if you could just scan the QR code and please send information for tutoring. Yes, we will definitely do that, but we also recommend you directly book that one-on-one. But as I was saying, any sort of feedback via this QR code would be greatly appreciated, ladies and gents. It's really important to us. It allows us to continue creating these, and we'd love to hear what you actually want us to speak about. So we can sit here and say
topics, everything.
The LSAT, but if there's a particular topic within the LSAT you'd like to know more about, we want to make sure that we deliver that to you. So Mika, there's another webinar next week. We do webinars once or twice a week. Either subscribe to your newsletter or just keep checking our website because it's always there. We always have a webinar running. And you know what? I'd love to throw this out there. We have an entire YouTube channel of like past webinars. So if you're in the process of studying, you kind of want to learn more, if there's a particular topic you're interested in, our website is also full of really awesome resources. Okay, Mika, I think this is a perfect question. I don't want to take up too much more of your time or the audience's, but can you give some guidance on where to begin studying for the LSAT if they have very little knowledge to go off of in the beginning?
So, number one, I would say we have some great resources on our website that can help with that, especially with regards to the application process and the whole thing as a whole, and setting good timelines. But the biggest place to go is lsac.org, lsac.org, right? That is the Law School Admissions Council. They are the people who make and administer the test. And when you do applications for law school, you'll do so through their credential assembly service. It's like the centralized hub. So check out our website for like the timeline, and then go check out their website to figure out like the actual rules, when the sittings are going to be in over the next, like, coming up in the next 9 months, all of that sort of stuff.
Amazing. So
yeah.
Let's see if there's any other really quick questions in here. Oh my gosh, let me just scroll up a little bit. Sorry, everyone. Let me see. I think we've answered a lot of them as we've been going. Okay, I like this question. What is your number one tip? And I'm paraphrasing, but what is your number one tip for test day? LSAT test day.
Number one tip for test day, if your blood sugar crashes during the exam, you're going to have a bad time. So eat a good breakfast and have a good snack at the 10-minute break in the middle. That would be legitimately my number one tip to do well on test day.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that, Mika. Once again, it was a pleasure to have you here. To our wonderful audience, we look forward to having you on more of our webinars. We look forward to all the discussions from here on forth. You have any kind of questions, comments, concerns, you have our email, send us a message. We'll make sure that if we can't answer it, we'll find somebody who can, or book again, keep going to that consultation. It's a really great opportunity for you guys to sit with somebody for free and just get those questions answered, right? I do see a question in here about how do we develop curriculum by ourselves if you can't afford a tutor. We actually have a free LSAT study schedule on our website. I think that's also a really great place to start. Mika, anything you'd like to add to that one? It seems like that question was bumped up a little bit.
Can you repeat it again?
So they're asking, how do they begin to develop a curriculum?
Their own curriculum.
Yeah.
R-LSAT will definitely have a lot of guidance. It might not always be good guidance, but there'll be a lot of opinions. No, I think just do some research. I think there are good resources out there for building a self-curriculum. It's not something that I would advise, but I do think there are good resources out there. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, thank you for answering that one last question. Thank you to our audience for being here tonight. And we look forward to having you on our next webinar. I hope everyone has a fantastic evening. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
Bye.